causing harm to some group of people. Those types of disasters tend to cause more loss of trust. So what are social movements? Social movements are organized activities that encourage and discourage social change. There's various types of social movements. First is alternative. This is the least threatening to the status quo and has limited impact on the general public. In other words, it has limited impact even on the small group's lives. Examples include Promise Keepers and vegetarianism. Redemptive social movements target specific people. They seek radical change, attempt to redeem. Examples include AA, NA, or GA, which stands for Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and Gamblers Anonymous. In redemptive movements, we can also see born-again Christians falling under this category. Reformative are limited social change movements, but target everyone. They're progressive, reactionary. Examples include multiculturalism and some types of environmental movement. Finally, revolutionary. These are your most extreme. These seek the transformation of an entire society. Examples include occupation movements, in other words, Occupy Wall Street. It would include the Revolutionary War, and any large-scale political economic movement such as civil rights movement or women's rights movements. Why? Because in order to facilitate equal rights for certain groups, what did we have to have? We had to have people willing to change the entire society. Depending on how you study the social movement, though, in that case, you can see how they would fall under, or civil rights movements could fall under, reformative or revolutionary. So oftentimes we have to study what actually occurred within the society, what changes resulted, and even who was involved. How do we do that? Well, we basically look at the reasons for why social movements occur. First, you have claims making. This is a process of trying to convince the public and public officials of the importance of joining a social movement to address a particular issue. This suggests who's going to know about the issue. When are we going to come out and try to elicit political or citizen support? You also have the deprivation theory. This is a social movement seeking change occurring among people who feel deprived. In other words, in a society where individuals feel that they are impoverished or looked at as being unequal, they're going to be more inclined to join a social movement. Then you have mass society theory. This suggests that socially isolated people seek out social movements as a way to gain a sense of belonging and importance. These arise in impersonal mass societies like the United States. Then you have cultural theory, or culture theory. This suggests that social movements depend not only on material resources and the structure of political power, but also on cultural symbols. Really easy. We've talked about this many, many times in the past. It's how we define people. In other words, it relies on ideas like, how are men and women defined? What does it mean to be a man or woman? What does it mean to be a particular type of person in our society? What is the language that we use in relation to this group versus that group? The culture theory suggests that we have a shared understanding of cultural symbols. Once mobilization in the social movement starts to occur, we see that the social movement gains strength as they develop a shared collective set of symbols amongst the group, and perhaps in society in general. Resource mobilization theory. This suggests that no social movement is likely to succeed or even get off the ground without substantial resources. What does that mean? Well, in order to get resources, oftentimes you have to find people who will be able to back you. In many cases, that means wealthy. This theory suggests that some types of social movements never get off the ground because they don't find people who are willing to back them. So we continue with more explanations of social movements. You have the structural strain theory. The structural strain theory suggests that structural conduciveness has to be present. In other words, that's a fancy way of saying society has to have a social problem. You have to have structural strain, or what we call relative deprivation. In other words, there has to be some form of social stratification and social inequalities that exist within a society. There has to be growth and spread of an explanation. Why does this occur? Why do we have this social problem? Whose fault is it? Precipitating factors also have to be present. Oftentimes, before a social movement really develops, you have to have something pretty earth-shattering to occur to kind of build momentum for the movement itself. Then you have mobilization for action. In other words, there becomes mobilization amongst the group, and people want to take part in it. Then you have a lack of social control or anomie that is taking place in the society or existing within the society. In other words, people don't feel like they have a sense of norm in society. So when anomie is present, you're more likely to find social movements occurring, at least according to the structural strain theory. Then you have the political economy theory. This is one that comes from the neo-Marxists. This suggests that people unite to address the societal ills caused by capitalism. This theory suggests that capitalism is not only a political and economic issue, but it's a part of our larger culture. It infiltrates every part of the culture. And then finally, you have the new social movements theory. This one's pretty easy. What's it about? Well, it's about the new types of social movements occurring in the world today. Its focus is going to be looking at the ways in which we attempt to improve our social and physical surroundings. In other words, they're suggesting, or the theorists involved in this group suggest, that today when social movements occur, it's usually because we want to improve something about society in terms of social justice and environmentalism. We're also going to look at things like international global developments. In other words, we're going to be looking at the global organizations. Things like Amnesty International, that basically are not just areas that we see in the United States or social movements occurring within areas of the United States, but rather a movement that occurs globally. So, with Amnesty International, we see the fact that it goes through multiple borders, multiple societies. Very different from something like the ACLU or the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is focused on areas or issues in the United States. And finally, we see that the middle and upper class are now the people likely to take part in a social movement that's taking place. In the past, it was the working class who would go out and riot. Today, not so much. So, stages of social movements. And I want you guys to pay special attention to this graph. This is the graph that we use and have been using since the 70s to describe the stages of social movements. So what stages do we have? What really occurs? Well, first you have the emergence of a social movement. In other words, the social problem is there, people latch on to the fact that there's a social problem, and they start to develop small groups. Then you have coalescence, where people start to go public. The social movement becomes a public movement. You see it on the news. You see it represented in technology, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Then you have the bureaucratic nature of social movements. In other words, social movements becoming bureaucratic. This is where we suggest that the radical edge is lost. So what happens here? There's various things you can see occurring. So social movements can be successful, or they can fail. They can adapt and change in some way to fit in better with society. They can be repressed by the society in general, or they can go mainstream. Think about recycling. Recycling is an example of a social movement that became mainstream. Back in the 80s and 90s, it wasn't considered to be normal. Now, how do we know it's mainstream? Well, you go to most public places, and what do you find? Recycling bins. Then finally, decline. This is where we start to see that there are organizational failures. And this occurs even in movements that are successful, who have adapted, or who have gone mainstream. The actual social movement itself declines. There becomes organizational failures, usually because of poor leadership and no money. People begin to sell out. Power becomes more important to the individuals within the group. Money becomes an issue. Or the group is so repressed that it can no longer act in society. So that concludes our discussion of collective behavior and social movements. Thank you.